following up on what Don was just saying, that kind of intimidation was going on as late as 1974 in Albuquerque, New Mexico. I have personally talked with a man who was involved in a sighting of craft, both triangular and spherical, in the Manzano Range in 1974, and it's a very long story, but the short is that he and colleagues were swept up by a security force and taken to Kirtland Air Force Base in an office because the only thing that they've ever known is that they saw a craft that had landed in the Manzano Range, triangular in shape, that had hieroglyphs on the top that they could see through binoculars. And that seemed to be of great concern to our government through security forces at Kirtland Air Force Base. And they held 3 of these people for 48 hours. And in the end, they told them with great threats that if they ever spoke, that they would be watched and monitored. And if they ever spoke about anything that happened when they were held at Kirtland, that they would end up in jail and they would have no possibility of a normal life. And that's 1974, a long time after 47 that our government has been playing hardball. And tonight, I thought that what I would do is share with you a presentation that I first did in 2008 because it includes videotape that I made with a man who had served in the Navy and, as far as I know, had firsthand his hands on photographs from Roswell, 1947, of the bodies in a hangar, and he sketched for me, as you will see in this presentation. And then the consequences to his own life for having seen these photographs in an unusual military context and how it followed him through the rest of his career until he got out of the Navy. And the last conversation he had was with a 4-star in Washington, D.C., in Space Command, who had a dialogue with him, I think, with an astonishing conclusion. So Jennifer, if you are ready, we will try this. Normally I have my fingers on my computer, and we're going to try this tonight with her and hopefully me giving you the right signals. Our government does not want public disclosure. That's the premise upon which all of us have to face and what we are standing on as we gather for this citizen hearing in 2013. It's been more than half a century of monitoring and interactions with non-humans by this government that does not want a single soul outside of inner sanctums to know. There is a formal policy of denial executed by President Harry S. Truman after July 1947 and the UFO crashes around Roswell. I have talked with a man who was working in the naval lab in White Sands, and he said it is his understanding that it was an executive order by Harry S. Truman. It is not privy to the American public, and yet it is an executive order that carries through all of this time since 1947 with such force that agency after agency in the inertia of batons being passed has kept and strengthened and deepened this policy of denial to the point that I frankly am of the opinion that it is the suppression of the extraterrestrial interaction with this planet that is turning the United States into a complete totalitarian police state. In the early 1990s, a Las Cruces, New Mexico resident named Andrew Kistner met me to talk about leaked documents and information from 2 military sources at the White Sands Missile Range. Their information was about our government's military aggression in the 1940s to 1950s against an alien disk technology, the disk technology retaliation, and American government clampdown to keep the truth from the media and the public. By the late 1990s, Andy Kistner was elected state representative for New Mexico's Doña Ana County. During his 2 years in state government, Andy was frustrated by the secrecy and denials he encountered when he tried to find out more about the alleged 1947 UFO crashes in the Roswell region. Andy had tried to help Congressman Steve Schiff of New Mexico in that congressman's own effort to open up more facts about the Roswell events. But even Congressman Schiff was blocked. Andy Kistner told me his private white sand sources not only categorized the disk technology as extraterrestrial, but the sources had an explanation for why there has been such a strict government policy of denial since the early 1940s, long before 1947. Before I go forward with insights from Andy Kistner's investigations, let's look at what was being discussed among President Harry S. Truman's investigators of the extraterrestrial biological presence on Earth. According to alleged and leaked government documents, a special executive order on September 24, 1947 was signed by President Truman to keep a tight lid on all non-human intelligence matters. President Truman allegedly handpicked a group of 12 people from top scientific, medical, military, and business leaders to study the extraterrestrial presence. And their code name was either Majority 12 or Majestic 12. I've had explanations for why both names have been used through history. Slide 2. In a September 24, 1947 MJ-12 mission statement, there was a preliminary white-hot intelligence assessment. It referenced another highly classified retrieval of an unidentified lenticular aerial technology, abbreviated to ULOT-1. That disk was in Cape Girardeau, Missouri, and the year was 1941. What was retrieved? The craft's propulsion system in this document is called a, quote, neutronic power plant, close quote. Who studied this neutronic power plant? Physicist Robert Oppenheimer, head of the top secret Manhattan Project in Los Alamos, which created the first atomic bombs dropped on Japan in 1945. These leaked Majestic 12 documents indicate the U.S. government already had extraterrestrial hardware and perhaps entities dead and alive long before the New Mexico crashes in July 1947. Slide 3. The MJ-12 first annual report of 1952 began, quote, a review of the President's special panel to investigate the capture of unidentified plan form. Plan form is anything that has this shape to it. Space vehicles by U.S. armed forces and agencies. Their conclusion, slide 4, quote, a consensus reached by members of the panel that until positive proof that the Russians did not attempt a series of reconnaissance flights over our most secure installations, the sightings and recovered objects are interplanetary in nature, close quote. Slide 5. In paragraph 1 of that same report, the MJ-12 panel stated, quote, V-2 rocket launches at the White Sands Proving Ground, New Mexico, have been knocked down by undetermined jamming. The source of the jamming is believed to come from UFO sightings on or near the range. Guidance systems are believed to be vulnerable, and this presents a clear and present danger. Such keeper flights carrying nuclear weapons are too horrific to contemplate. Shielding of systems and circuits are underway. Slide 6. As to purpose and modus operandi, we are not certain, but it is clear that if these visitors had conquest in mind, it would not be difficult for them, given their ability to penetrate our airspace at will and their ability to jam radio, telephone, television, and teletype transmissions, let alone power grids, close quote. Did the United States government share these astonishing facts with any other leaders on this planet, let alone the American public? Slide 7. Paragraph L, Foreign Policy and National Security states, quote, to date, only Great Britain, Canada, and the Soviet Union are contacted and appraised in the event invasion is imminent. It is the current policy of the administration that no other foreign countries will be consulted or advised. The national security status of the Majestic operation exceeds that of the H-bomb development. The classification is higher, as we have heard before. Slide 8. It has been the downfall of great nations and cultures when a new reality is not readily accepted by the masses. The social order was severely ravaged by the last World War, with great damage to the religious dogma of earth without end, thus making a government disclosure irresponsible and inherently dangerous. Close quote. Slide 9. Under paragraph P, Government Policy of Control and Denial, MJ-12 expressed concern about controlling the press and said, quote, it is the recommendation of the President's special panel with concurrence from Majestic 12 that a policy of strict denial of the events surfacing from Roswell, New Mexico, and any other incident of such caliber be enforced. An interactive program of controlled releases to the media in such fashion to discredit any civilian investigation be instituted in accordance with the provisions of the 1947 National Security Act, close quote. Slide 10. In Annex B, paragraph 21, the panel chairman, who was MIT physicist Vannevar Bush, PhD, argued for, quote, funding air defense projects that would be useful in combating the new menace, meaning aerial discs, instead of developing ballistic missiles, which have proved to be useless, close quote, meaning that in attacking the discs, the missiles had failed. President Truman had appointed Vannevar Bush to be head of the Office of Scientific Research and Development, also known as OSRD. OSRD's largest project was the Manhattan Project at Los Alamos. Vannevar Bush was also in the President's MJ-12 group to study the extraterrestrial presence. Slide 11. The MJ-12 panel added Annex C, paragraph 2 to 3 in their first annual report, which warned, quote, men, equipment, weapons vanish without a trace. In all instances, the disappearances of our technology occurred in tropical climate and in the heat of battle or near combat zones. Missing aircraft, pilots, and crew are of special concern to the military when no explanations fit the usual reasons outside of combat. One such incident is the disappearance of a flight of 5 U.S. Navy TBM-3 Avenger torpedo bombers from the Naval Air Station in Fort Lauderdale, Florida on December 5th, 1945. Slide 12. It is believed that Flight 19 encountered a phenomenon of celestial nature. I'm reading from the Majestic 12 document. Celestial, by definition, relates to the sky or heaven. The last known radio transmission from the instructor pilot was heard by a ham operator, quote, don't come after me. They look like they are from outer space. I'm at 2,300 feet. Don't come after me. Then 2 years later, on January 7th, 1948, and about 7 months after the Roswell UFO crashes, U.S. Air Force Captain Thomas Mantell tried to pursue a large silver disk near Godman Air Force Base in Kentucky, but he died in the subsequent crash of his plane. Slide 13. The Majestic 12 panel quoted the last radio transmission from Captain Mantell, quote, It appears to be a metallic object, and it is of tremendous size, close quote. The MJ-12 panel further explained that, quote, when Godman personnel arrived at the crash scene, slide 14, Mantell's F-51 was found in many pieces, not large sections as one would find from a free stick descent. The wreckage contained unusual damage, as if Mantell's plane was repeatedly hit by shotgun blasts. Some of the metal had pitted surfaces and unusual scoring. All rubber material had disintegrated in a soft, powdery substance. There was no indication of gunfire damage or fuel burn. The crash site and debris exhibited an unusually high amount of radiation of undetermined nature, close quote. Slide 15. MJ-12's Annex C, paragraph 5 continued, quote, from 1949 to late 1950, there have been several crashes of B-36 bombers on routine Arctic patrol that bear all the earmarks of the Mantell incident. None of the crews were found. The atomic bombs were not recovered, thus creating a serious problem for the Air Force when nuclear weapons are lost over friendly countries, close quote. Arctic patrol encounters the earmarks of the Kentucky Mantell incident. So government insiders say that the Majestic 12 group under President Harry S. Truman was at first trying to carry out a secret war against the disk technology until the human military effort proved futile. Details about the secret war began to emerge for me, first from former U.S. Air Force and UFO investigator Leonard Stringfield. Back around 1984, Len told me that he knew firsthand that the Air Force had a standing order to shoot down the UFO disks, triangles, and other unidentified aerial objects. But Len said, quote, we lost so many planes and pilots trying to carry out the order, it was rescinded in the early 1950s. Then, in the mid-1990s, former New Mexico State Representative Andrew Kistner told me about his official research into the 1947 V-2 rocket program, UFO crashes, and retrievals in New Mexico. He had off-the-record conversations with military and intelligence operatives from White Sands Missile Range and the Naval Research Lab housed at White Sands. Kistner had assembled many old newspaper articles and some leaked documents that he shared. And he asserted that in the 1940s to the early 1950s, there was an American government policy to shoot down unidentified aerial disks. But the disks retaliated. Many of our pilots died, which forced an end to our shoot-down policy. Andy Kistner said he learned that President Harry S. Truman ordered a policy of denial in the interest of national security about all UFO crash retrievals, that classified executive order that is allegedly still enforced to this day. To underscore the reality of the extraterrestrial presence and government knowledge about this, I would like to share excerpts from a videotaped interview that I produced with one of the few military sources in my career who has been willing to talk on the record about extraterrestrial biological entities with his own name, his rank, providing me all of his naval papers, his DD-214, all of his honors, and slide 16. His name is Thomas Coleman Shepard. He served in the U.S. Navy from September 1975 until his retirement 20 years later in 1995 as an E-7 Chief Petty Officer, Chief Yeoman. Tom said that he wanted to go on the record about his extraterrestrial knowledge because he told me, quote, I can't believe our government is still keeping this a secret. Tom strongly feels that the public should be told the truth. Next slide. Here is Thomas Coleman Shepard's naval history of assignments from March 26, 1976 to 1978 with Amphibious Group 1, Pacific fleet at White Beach in Okinawa, Japan. Next slide. We're going back to Thanksgiving night in 1976. Tom was stationed at White Beach Naval Base in Okinawa. At the time, he was a seaman apprentice to the staff of Commander Amphibious Group 1. Most of his work was simply clerical at the time. Next slide. That Thanksgiving night, he was in the administration building with two other men, Robert Turman and Craig Howard. Howard was mechanically gifted, and he liked to prove that he could get into sensitive areas that were off limits. And that Thanksgiving night, Craig Howard had gotten into a vault that contained classified material, and he was yelling for Turman to join him. Tom Shepard watched as Turman ran by into the administration office that contained this vault that was top secret. Shepard wondered what Howard had found that was so urgent. Listen now as retired Navy Chief Yeoman Tom Shepard tells what happened. Sound? We had sound working before. You can re-rack it if we can get the sound up. Where's the gentleman who was running sound? Is he here? Jennifer?
I saw Howard and Topin go into the vault. And they were in there for about 5 minutes. And Howard comes out first, and Topin follows. And Topin's kind of got tears in his eyes, and he said that it's true. Well, this really caught my attention, so I was really astounded to hear, you know, this kind of reaction from him. So then Howard, he calls me over and he says, come on in. So I go in there, right, and it's a vault, and it's a small room, and it's got the filing cabinets and the safes. And it's got a table right there in the middle of the vault. The table's about the size of this, but square and taller. And on that table, he had this file laid out. And this file was, it was like all spread out on the table here, okay? And it had photographs and documents and the covers and everything. And he said, this is what it's all about, and he handed me one of the photographs. And I looked at it, and I had no idea what I was looking at. It was an old black and white photograph. It had a old truck in it, and down on the ground, and you could tell they were out in the desert, was some sort of a creature. It looked like, well, what I would call now an alien creature. I had no idea what I was looking at back then, so I said to Howard, well, what am I looking at here? He goes, well, what do you think? I said, I don't know. He says, alien creature from outer space, you big dummy. And I go, no, it is not. And he goes, oh, you're looking right at one of these, and you still can't believe it? Won't believe it? That's incredible. So I looked at that photograph, and I looked at another photograph that had them laid out on a skid, and looked at two other photographs, and they had a very dark black background, and one of them was a headshot, and the other photograph was of it an elongated shot on a type of gurney. And I looked at the documents, and there was a lot of red ink, top secret. One of the words was magic, and magic was spelt with a J. And I even made a comment to Howard. I says, look here, they can't even spell magic right. They spelled it with a J. It just looked like an old file, but the gauge of the year would have to be from the 30s or the 40s, just based on the truck. The aliens sort of looked like that one down in the Roswell Museum, but different too. Because it's black and white, you couldn't really get a lot of tone with the kind of skin it had. But if I had to describe it at all, it would have been like snake skin in sort of way.
Can you explain that further?
They had a whitish kind of appearance, but you could tell it had some color to it. And if I had to describe it as matches any other type of animal that I know of, it would have been like that of a white snake, say.
And could you discern scales?
Not really, no. No, but you could tell that they just looked like bumps, and who knows what they were. And it was throughout. But mostly like on the arm area and on the head area.
And was this being wearing any clothes?
No, you could tell that. And here are some renditions of drawings that I made of the photographs that I saw in Okinawa. And what you have here is a desert and the alien entity. Here's the guy in the jeans and the cowboy boots. Here's the truck, and here's the entity in the truck looking out. And in the actual photograph, though, you could barely make him out because of the angle of the sun and what it was doing from the slats to him. So I had to actually have this pointed out to me. This is what we call photograph number 1. This is another rendition. This is at the aircraft hangar. Okay. Pretty much, this is really a rendition because of the angle and all. I really am not an artist, okay, so I couldn't really draw it to the right angle. But over here is the military man in his khaki pants, his brown shoes, and this is the front of the aircraft hangar. This is the opening here. And I tried to, what really stood out for me in this photograph was the angle of the slants from the panes of the windows from the hangar, of the style of hangar that it was. Mm-hmm. And here's the alien that's mostly intact, and next to him, or it, is the other alien that was crumpling in a fetal position, and most of its side had been badly damaged. And here's the alien that's next to it, and I tried to make a rendition here of the crumpling and everything, but I didn't do a good job, really. But most of its head, as I recall, was badly damaged either through charring of some sort or other damage.
And burned.
Or burned, yeah. Okay. And here's another rendition. Now, in the photograph, this is, of course, all black, okay? But what you're seeing is where the flash took the photograph of what you can see here, and it's a gurney in an elongated fashion, okay? And the alien entity laying on top of the gurney. And there you have it. And evidently in the same space, they took a close-up of the alien's head from the neck on up with the same black background. And here it is, as I best recall. And I tried to get as best to make it look as real as I could by not giving too much detail with the eyes. But the eyes, the sockets are very almond-shaped, and they're fatter up here, and they skinny down, okay? They're fatter here, and they skinny down. And the blotting I'm trying to describe here, okay, looks sort of, well, veiny, I guess you could say, or just bumps. And that was the best I could describe it here.
And this reminded you of reptilian?
Yeah, you could tell that it was sort of reptilian-ish, but at the same time, no, you really couldn't because of the black and white photo, okay? I do recall that its neck was, in comparison to its head, really this skinny, and it had a lot of wrinkles.
As if it were old?
No, as if it was just the way it was, the way it was.
But did that remind you also of a reptile?
Mm-hmm, yeah. I tried to make a description of how long its fingers are and in comparison to its wrist. Mm-hmm. This is a better drawing, okay, of its palm in this fashion, all right, without a thumb. If it had a thumb, it was this sort of a nib-looking thing here. And it did have these slanted tip fingertips, and on the tips, you could tell it was sort of a roundness, or what I call a suction cup. Linda, there is nothing on this earth that we know of that looks anything like this. It's not a human being. I'm telling you straight up. It wasn't a monkey. It wasn't an animal of any kind. It was like nothing that I had ever seen, and that's all I could say. It was definitely not a human. It was definitely not an animal that we know of.
What emotion did you feel?
I was in shock. I mean, what can I say? I mean, I didn't want to believe it. I couldn't even accept it at the time. It took hours for me to even accept what I had saw. Even with a guy that was older than me that was telling me, look at what you're looking at here, okay? These were not fakes. This was real stuff. I was overwhelmed.
Next slide. Tom Shepard and his two Navy colleagues, Craig Howard and Robert Turman, thought that they had been able to enter the classified vault without anyone knowing or finding out. But on the Monday after that 1976 Thanksgiving weekend, the three men were summoned by a very angry chief, James Seeley. Tom saw the other two men had to put on their dress uniforms for some kind of punishment, and he was kept in his office in detention for several hours. But Thomas Shepard was never asked once to sign a non-disclosure agreement swearing him to secrecy for the rest of his life, and he attributed it to the fact that Chief James Seeley treated him like a son and even called him son. 2 weeks after their vault adventure, Captain Seeley ordered Tom Shepard, Robert Turman, and Craig Howard to drive with him to a dentist at Kadena Air Force Base, about an hour from White Beach. Tom was put to sleep and never told what the dentist did. He thinks the other two men were treated the same way. But his Navy records mysteriously never included the Kadena Air Force Base dentist visit. I asked Tom if the dentist might have implanted monitoring devices in their teeth. Tom said that a few years later, he learned that was possible to do, and he figured that that is what had been done. The tooth bothered him after the Okinawa dentist visit, and he finally had it pulled in the 1990s by a civilian dentist in the United States who asked, "When did you do intelligence work?" Tom said he had never done intelligence work, but he did not tell the dentist about what had happened in Okinawa, but knew that the dentist had worked on people before who had had something similar, and he linked them to monitors in the intelligence world. Several months after the three men were taken to the Kadena Air Force Base dentist, Tom finally learned more from Craig Howard that the vault photos and files were from a UFO crash near Roswell, New Mexico in the late 1940s. Next slide. We need audio.
What was all that?
Can you re-rack?
And tell me what you know about. It was probably a couple of months after the incident that I finally came up to Howard and I said, okay, what was all that? And tell me what you know about what we saw. And he told me about Roswell. And he said that, he said two things, really. He said that he had heard of Roswell before, and that he did see Roswell in those documents. And that flying saucers, or whatever you wanted to call them at the time, did crash in New Mexico in the 40s, and that the government, or the military, whatever you want to call it, okay, recovered the bodies, and we've been hiding them ever since. I eventually transferred in March of '78. Topin got accepted for a naval officer candidate school program, and Howard transferred sometime in '77. And I'll never forget that day either.
What happened?
Well, he had made second class, which was E5, okay? And I thought he was doing really good. And there at the last minute, or within weeks of having to have gotten to re-enlist, he backed out. So I came up to him on the day he was leaving. He was in his uniform. And I said, Howard, you know, what gives, man? You know, life is good. You made second class. Why are you getting out? And he said, Tom, I just can't do it no more. I said, does it have anything to do with, he said, the vault, you know, what we saw in that? And he looked at me, and he got beet red, and he was shaking his finger at me, and he said, don't you ever bring that up to me again. And that was the last thing I ever heard from him. And I haven't seen him in over 30 years now.
Did you take it from that comment that he had been punished because of the vault incident?
I believe that, well, it's either one of two things. I think they jacked with him myself. I think they gave him threats. But it could have been just that he knew a truth, and it wasn't going to go anywhere. And he didn't like that.
Were you asked to sign any kind of a non-disclosure agreement?
No, never. Let's jump ahead to 1989. Unsolved Mysteries comes on TV, and it was a popular show then. And one night, they played, Robert Stack hosting, the Roswell incident. And I had no idea at the time that this was in books or had already been talked about. I was literally blown away. And I thought to myself, well, you know, if national TV is going to come out and blast it all over the place, what's to stop me? So at the time, I worked at a 3-star command there in Norfolk. It was ComNav Airland. And I worked for the operations department. It's Code 30, and one of the people in Code 30 was a man named Captain Wood. And he had a person that worked for him who was a lieutenant commander, and I don't remember his last name. But one day, it was shortly after this was played on TV, the Roswell incident on Unsolved Mysteries, the subject of ETs came up, and we were just talking, and even though I had been, well, I'd run into a lot of trouble in other commands, not a lot of trouble, but, well, somewhat anyway, okay? We could get into that. But I had opened my mouth before, okay? And I was tired of keeping it closed. So I told this lieutenant commander who worked for Captain Wood what I knew, and I told him the whole Okinawa story, and the file, and the photos, and the whole thing. And I thought the guy was going to have a heart attack. He went into shock. He got really angry. He wanted to tape record me. He started making threats on me. We got to sort of a heated argument. And he said that he was going to have to tell Captain Wood about this. So I said, fine, tell him. So a couple hours later, Captain Wood calls me in his office. He says, sit down. Heard you did some talking today. And I said, yes, sir, I sure did. You want to tell me what you told Lieutenant Commander down there? All right. So I told him the whole Okinawa story. And he said, all right. I'm pretty convinced that you saw what you saw. But just so you know, we don't call them aliens. I said, we don't? No. We call them EBEs, for extraterrestrial biological entities. I said, all right, well, that makes sense. Then we had a conversation, and it was basically like this. I asked him why we had kept this under wraps for all these years, and what did it have to do with the military and the whole thing. And he gave me some descriptions about it. He said that since that period of time, and on up till, present day, that...
You're talking about the 40s to 1990?
Yeah, the 40s to 1990.
Right.
Okay. That they had been using this, and it was all for good reasons.
They had been using what?
Well, I've never really understood that either. They've been using the technology that the aliens gave them, or they've been using the crashed vehicles. Even though he said that, okay, it was just sort of inference that, yeah, the whole thing that we recovered, okay? So that's how I took it.
That our government was using?
Yes.
For?
What we had recovered.
For?
For purposes of military advantage. I asked him if the president knew, and he said, can't go there. I asked him how this might have an effect on society and religion. And basically the whole thing was people couldn't handle it. That there'd be too much shock. And we've got to maintain this under wraps. It could be disruptive to society. It could be disruptive to the Bible. And so, you know, I asked him, I said, well, you know, look, yeah, you have the Bible, okay, but it's not like as if people aren't going to, you know, people are going to just quit believing in Jesus or anything, okay? Come on. He said, no, but, you know, this could open the door to several other things in the Bible that, you know, we wouldn't want and religions to have to deal with, okay? It could just open a door to many things that would be so disruptive, we can't go there. So you just need to keep this under wraps. You're not in trouble or anything, okay? And that's it. And if you say that we had this conversation, you can, you know, it didn't happen. So if you know what's good for you, you're going to keep this under wraps. You want to make chief, don't you? I said, yeah. All right, well, let's play ball by the rules then.
Did you ask him when the public and the media would be allowed to know?
No, probably never.
Is that what he said?
That's what he said. Probably never.
But that means the planet is living in a huge lie.
Yes, of course it does. Especially when you accept that when you're in the military. You accept that because you're working with secret material all the time. And you understand that the United States maintains military advantage over our enemies. And you accept that. That's an okay answer for a military guy.
But isn't that an incredible answer? Probably never, that the world would be kept in the dark forever? We
went there, and I respectfully tried to argue with him. I said, yes, when we recovered the aliens, okay, that was the 1940s. That's completely different from today. This is the 90s, okay? People would be able to handle it. And he said, oh, yeah, you think so? I said, well, could you handle it? No. Did it scare you? Yeah. Would it be old news in 2 weeks? I don't know.
How does that make you feel as an American?
Oh, that's a big question. How does that make me feel as an American? I think the public should be given the truth. And that's all there is to it. Enough is enough. For years, I've understood the need for secrecy, but I can't accept it no more. Not for this. Not to arrogantly and outlandishly just come right out with books and in media to say Roswell didn't happen. It hurts.
And it would seem that the special insiders of our government with a need to know about the extraterrestrial biological entity presence have actually been running scared since at least 1947, if not a decade before, and trying to keep any signs of their fear and lack of control from the press and the public. But at the same time, their goal has been to get the extraterrestrial craft any way they could, including trying to shoot them down in order to gain and sustain military superiority over American human enemies with the advanced technologies. There's a whole section of a presentation that I have done on what was called peculiar phenomena at Roswell in the 1940s, defined by Turner, who ran the base for some period of time. And those peculiar phenomena were the disks that were always coming up when they launched some of the V-2 missiles. And perhaps the peculiar phenomena was here or is still here only to monitor Earth for whatever reason, and has never intended harm until threatened by human military aggression. But then there are the dissected bodies, including animals, referenced in the government's own highly classified interplanetary phenomena unit and Majestic 12 reports, which go into detail about the excisions of animals and finding bodies in the desert at one of the Roswell crashes, quote, dissected as one would a frog, close quote. And the document does not make it clear if the dissected bodies found were human, alien, or animal. And then there is the hemorrhaging deaths of security men who handled crash site bodies. The animal mutilations are famous for being bloodless, without tracks associated with mysterious lights and beams, and they continue worldwide to date. Thousands of mutilated animals have been reported all over the planet. And what about all the human abduction complaints since at least the early 1960s, also associated with mysterious lights and beams? The peculiar phenomena from the 1940s at White Sands have continued into the 21st century. But someone seems to have stopped the disks crashing. Did the peculiar phenomena change, or did our military strategy, because payback was too painful? I don't have all the answers to those questions, but I stand before you tonight at this citizen hearing, and we have seen some facets of this complex phenomena, and this is one, that there have been military exchanges between us and them for reasons that are not clear, except perhaps human aggression alone has provoked some kind of retaliation. Where does it go from May 2013 forward? We would all like at least the truth to come out so that the human family would have the strength of knowledge before whatever happens next, either initiation by the non-humans or a faction of non-humans themselves that would pull the rug out from under the controllers on the planet currently, or a collaboration of the controllers and the non-humans for purposes yet unknown. Either way, what I've just shown to you tonight is one more facet that includes a high-ranking authority in Washington, D.C., whose position is that you and I should never be told about what our so-called representative government knows about other life in the universe and its interactions with this planet, and I, for one, think that is wrong. Thank you. And is there somebody at 9? I could take a question. If there's somebody at 9, I don't remember the program. It's 5 till 9. Time slips everywhere. Yes, sir. They've been outside of any congressional interaction right from the beginning of the setup of the classified executive order. It's my understanding. And if you look, I was talking with some people today. I did this as an exercise in Denver when I was the director of special projects at Channel 7, and I was working on A Strange Harvest. I went to the law library in Denver, And they knew who I was from Channel 7 and did lots of research. And all I did was say, would you please bring me the National Security Act of 1947? And the librarian looked at me and said, what volume? I said, all of it. She said, are you serious? I said, yeah, I want to see the whole act. She said, well, you're going to have to wait. It's going to take a while to get it all here. I had no idea what was going to come. And she brought the National Security Act of 1947 to me in 1 or 2 wagons. It was stacked. I don't remember now whether it was 17 volumes. It's probably 36 volumes now. And when I started reading Volume 1, and really in many ways, go through this exercise just to see how many volumes are brought to you from a singular act, the National Security Act, that began in 1947. Do it as an exercise. But the part that struck me, because I looked at different pieces in a lot of the volumes, it was reading in Volume 1, the budget is set up outside of the purview of Congress. There is no oversight. It's all stated. This is an agency that is set up over here completely and totally autonomous. And what is happening in 2013, September? If you do not know about or have not heard about the Utah Data Center, it is 1 million square feet on the surface with God only knows how many underground levels of the largest ears and eyes spy installation that the world has ever known, owned, operated and controlled by the National Security Agency a few miles west of Provo. And in this valley of trees in Utah, this 1 million square foot facility, the Utah Data Center, has been given approval by some representation. They have tried to pretend like they go to a Foreign Intelligence Committee in Congress to get some approval for what they do when they will run ripshod no matter what. A year ago, for those of you who read Earth Files and listen to Coast and Dreamland, you know that in December of 2012, not that long ago actually, I did a very long interview with William Bamford, who is the only human on this planet who has had the courage to write about the National Security Agency in 3 books. And because he was the first to do the Puzzle Palace about 20-some years ago, another man working inside the National Security Agency named William Binney sought out William Bamford for help. And the reason? After 9/11 and the horror and Holocaust of that, William Binney was approached by his overseers at the National Security Agency. William Binney had by then been working, I believe, for almost 30 years as one of the major mental architects of the National Security Agency's ears and eyes on the world, a brilliant genius mind with zeros and ones. And William Binney says he was told that after 9/11, they now wanted him to do software to turn the ears and eyes of the NSA also on the entire United States. And William Binney, talking to Bamford, who has talked to me about this in great detail, William Binney told them that he would not. And they told him that if he would not, he would lose his job. And William Binney left the National Security Agency without any fanfare. Nothing reached the public. But a series of events occurred, and he realized that his knowledge was a threat. And he felt that events occurred and that his life was in jeopardy. That's why he sought out James Bamford. In the discussions with James Bamford that led up to December of 2012, a little less than half a year ago, chess moves are going on between the NSA and William Binney, and not just William Binney, but 2 other leakers. And Bamford said that he now realizes that we are at a point in the history of this country that is truly the metaphor of the frogs or the lobsters in the pot, in which the heat started being turned up at very low, and gradually we are now cooked in terms of a police state that is masquerading in red and blue and white bunting and elections that don't count. And Bamford said that in December, they were standing together and they were talking because William Binney really doesn't know what's going to happen. And he said he was talking with Bamford about the Utah data center and everything that it will do, can do. It will listen to everything, every digital, every window vibration of every office. They now have technologies from satellites that can penetrate down, I've been told, 3 stories in a house or a building, and an infrared, people that I've heard describe people making love in bed, on the toilet, it doesn't matter. They can see it in screens and in SA buildings as clearly as day. And Bamford said that William Binney, almost exhausted in his frustration that the United States is slipping into a police state while everybody seems to be aware of how sick everything is, and that Binney reached his hand out to Bamford in the room where they were standing, and he put his fingers about this far apart, 1/4 of an inch, and he said, "James, the United States is that close to a turnkey totalitarian state." And the context is the September 2013 official turn on of the Utah data center, and this is May. And Binney told Bamford, who told me, that the astonishing underbelly of how all of this is occurring has even gone so far that the National Security Agency has gotten some committee to sign off on the fact that the NSA has presented a dictionary of its definitions of what it does that remains constitutional. Bamford laughed when he said this. That remains constitutional. And the one definition that I remember so clearly, because it is so backwards, upside down, Alice in Wonderland. NSA will be able to record every single conversation, email, window vibration, anything, everything. And their dictionary, new NSA dictionary definition of intercept is now defined as: intercept occurs only when the digital information is analyzed by a human mind and translated into words on some sort of a document or digital communication that can be received and analyzed by another human mind from which a report is made. How do we put that genie back in the bottle? And if we can't, and the extraterrestrials are at the base of the whole effort to spy and suppress and build policies of lying because these 3-star commander says it will disrupt society and therefore we can never tell the truth. What kind of a prison are we in? And that's why I think the citizen hearing is so vital. And I am so glad I've been able to participate and meet some of you, and that I feel that people are beginning to understand how complex this all is. And that it is not easy, but my God above, if we do not have a nation that is based on facts and truth, And if we as a public allow ourselves to go forward in the future, knowing what we know and not trying to leverage up in the truth, then we get the nation and the world, I guess, that we deserve. It is really tough, and it all goes back to World War II, our government in England deciding that there had to be a policy of denial about something that seems at one level so simple. We're not alone, and that other intelligences are interacting here, and we all should have been told then. What a difference the last 60 years might have been. But at least maybe we still have a chance to get some truth. Thank you.
Testing. Oh, that's a great help. Can we center it? That's not so easy, huh? Is that the right distance? Testing, 1, 2, 3, 4. Testing. You can't center it, huh?
Well, if I do, there's no shadow.
Okay. Oh, I see. You got more than one consideration. All right. I like to lean to the left anyway, so. Yeah, no, I don't think so. And we have people on the internet, don't we? Listening? Okay.
Nice one to Jamie out of the bottom.
Uh-huh. Is that the right distance? Is that close enough?
Go ahead and just talk as you would.
Okay.
See what happens.
Testing 1, 2, 3, 4. Testing 1, 2, 3, 4. Sounds good from here. Thank you. Everybody ready to go? If you'll get seated, please, we'll get started here. And all those people on the internet, pour your favorite beverage, sit in your comfortable chair, and we'll be rolling here within minutes. Thank you very much to everybody for being here tonight. My name is Peter Davenport. I'm one of the witnesses at the citizens hearing. I'm the director of the National UFO Reporting Center, which is located in Washington State. I've been its director for almost 19 years. The National UFO Reporting Center was founded in October of 1974, and it's been in continuous operation since that time. What it is a facility that allows people, used to be in the United States, now because of the international nature of the telephone system and the internet system, we receive reports of UFO sightings from around the world. I'm delighted to be here. Thanks for coming, everybody, and thanks to everybody on the internet who's listening to this lecture. I should make an announcement. We're running a little bit late. That seems to be the standard here. I certainly violated that myself this morning. The last bus, if you're going north, the last bus to the Washington Plaza leaves, I'm told, at 10:15, so perhaps the AV people in the back could watch the time. And when we get close to that, maybe we'll make an announcement if you want to take that bus. Anyway, I'm delighted to be here, and I'm delighted to share with you the best evidence for the visitation of our planet by these objects we call UFOs tonight. Evidence, information collected over the last 19 years. What you're going to see is the best data that I can present on the subject. Next slide, please, Jennifer. Do we have a slide? Yeah. All right, thank you. There we go. Let me outline for you what I'm going to present in the next approximately an hour. What I'd like to do is give you a brief introduction. It usually lasts between 5 and 15 minutes, but depending on how loquacious I am. And then I have a series of the very best cases or reports that have come into the National UFO Reporting Center over the last 19 years. And I'm going to start going through those, and when people are no longer sitting in the audience, I know I've gone too long, and we'll just wrap it up, and everybody will head for the bar. So that's the plan. I don't know how deep I will get into these cases, how many of them I'll be able to talk about, but let me just go through them one after the other, and then we'll launch into a description of each one of them. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, they're in more or less sequential order except the last one. The first case will be from my home state, Washington State, from the city of La Crosse, Washington. A woman ran into something as she was driving her 6 kids home. I'll talk about the Pennsylvania fireball, a very dramatic case, and we'll show some video. The next one, I will talk about the Phoenix Lights, probably the greatest, most dramatic UFO event in the history of ufology over the last 66 years or so. I'll talk about a Bangor submarine base, a disc that flew right over our nuclear weapons. I'll talk about the abduction case, the Washington State elk abduction case of February 25th, 1999. An elk was lifted out of the forest by a UFO in front of 14 forestry workers, scared the daylights out of them. I'll show you the photographs of that. I may have time for the New Mexico flash, and I've got some very good video. I'll talk briefly about the Todd Seas case, a gentleman who our best evidence suggests was sucked up into a saucer while wearing his underwear off a mountaintop in Pennsylvania. 39 and a half hours later, they found his mutilated body hanging in a tree. And the last case I'll talk about, if I have time, is the mutilated car case. You hear about mutilated animals. In the Todd Seas case, we'll talk about a mutilated human being. You've probably never heard about a mutilated car. I'll show you some very, very interesting photos. Could I have the next slide, please, Jennifer? You might ask, how, Peter, did you settle on these cases? We have 86,000, maybe 87,000 cases in our database. About 76,000 of those cases are more or less legitimate or qualified in one sense or another and are on our website. You might ask, how do you get from 76,000 cases down to about 7? Let me explain the criteria that we applied to select the cases for this presentation. First of all, the case that any of the cases I talk about tonight is a dramatic case. In addition to its being dramatic, there were multiple and independent witnesses, not just a man and a wife standing on a corner in a city somewhere reporting the same thing. The witnesses report similar events, so we know that the witnesses are talking about the same event. And the evidence we have is there's some kind of objective evidence in the form, for example, of photographs or video, and some degree of investigation was conducted after the event occurred and after it had been reported to our center. Could I have the next slide, please, Jennifer? If we have any time, I will discuss a few other points. I'd love to talk about my proposal for detecting UFOs out to a distance of 250,000 miles from the surface of the Earth. We may not have time. I'll talk about the very dramatic recent fireball sightings that have been reported to the National UFO Reporting Center since the second week of June last year. If I don't get to those cases, or if I don't get to that case, I commend to your attention the roughly 3,000 or 4,000 reports that have come in of fireballs since the second week of June last year, 2012. I'll talk about maybe the UFOs and press, although I talked about that this morning a little bit. I might launch into what it all means, in my opinion. We'll leave a little time for Q&A. Next slide, please, Jennifer. Some of the questions that I would like to try to resolve in the course of this presentation are the following. First of all, do astronomers ever see UFOs? How many people think that astronomers see UFOs? Few hands, maybe 5 or 6. Good. Well, most astronomers, the professional astronomers who need a pinstripe suit to read their lectures before a class, would tell you, well, if they're UFOs, we would see them, right? Well, we'll talk about that. The next question I would like to resolve in the course of making my presentation tonight is, does the U.S. government know about UFOs? This panel, our committee, has been listening to people talk about that subject for the last 3 days. I think it's pretty clear in the minds of most of us who've sat in on those that it's probably the case. Do we ever capture good, high-quality photographs or video of UFOs? I'm going to set that question aside for a moment. And do UFOs ever have malfunctions? Do they ever crash? Well, we heard the crash at Roswell, and people alluded to the crash at Aztec during today's testimony. Very good testimony, in my opinion. But I'll present the evidence that I have. I think you'll be a little bit surprised. And if UFOs are real objects, how long have they been coming to Earth? That's a pretty interesting question. And I'll present evidence that will, I think, convince most or all of you that it did not start on the 24th of June, 1947. Next slide, please, Jennifer. My interest in UFOs started very early. In fact, I believe it started on the 17th of July, 1954 in St. Louis, Missouri. I was a lad of 6 at that time. I was seated in the right-hand seat of a 53 Studebaker, our family car, and we saw, together with hundreds, possibly thousands, maybe tens of thousands of people, a very, very dramatic UFO sighting. I'm not going to take time right now to talk about that, but I think that planted the hook in my jaw, figuratively speaking, for ufology. And by 1965, I felt like an old salt when it came to UFOs. I'd done a lot of reading. I was very, very interested in the subject. My parents indulged me. They bought me books on the subject. This is a photocopy of an article I wrote. The date you may not be able to see, but it's September 13th, 1965. I graduated from high school June of 1965 up in Derry, New Hampshire. Worked for the newspaper, and on the 3rd of September 1965, very, very dramatic sighting occurred in close to Exeter, New Hampshire. It's called the incident at Exeter. In point of fact, it occurred in Kensington, New Hampshire. People are they're sticklers about the names of their towns up there. They don't like to be misnamed or shunned in any way. Anyway, that was my first article. That was the first of two. A slightly younger Peter B. Davenport, a 63 photo. Next slide, please, Jennifer. Been a lot of articles since then. The Chicago Tribune did an article on January 1st, 2007. In fact, you may have seen the CNN video of the gentleman who saw, several gentlemen who saw the disc above gate C-17 at O'Hare Airport. They did a very extensive article in the Chicago Tribune. John Hilkovich was the author. I had done everything but drive to Chicago and beat him over the head with a cotton ball to try to get him to do that article. He resisted for weeks. Suddenly he decided to do it when I sent him some objective data. He just forgot in his article to write where he had received the information from. Next slide, please, Jennifer. LA Times. Front page, Friday, 28th of March, 2008. Tomas Alec Tizon was the author. Actually, he was a bureau chief for the LA Times in Seattle, Washington, and he contacted me months earlier. Finally, in early March 2008, he came out to my home in eastern Washington. I live about 50 miles west of Spokane, out in the wheat country, and we spent a day together. Very, very nice guy. Wrote a delightful article. While he was at my home, he admitted to me that he was considering doing sort of a lampoon of this crazy guy out in eastern Washington who believed in UFOs, spent his whole day answering the phone and talking about UFOs. While he was there, after I'd shown him some of the data that you will see tonight, he called his editor in Los Angeles and said, I would like twice the space in the LA Times that I have been allotted for this article. That's the article. That structure in the background is part of the underground ICBM missile site that I own in eastern Washington. It's the reason I moved out there from Seattle. The day this article was published, again, Friday, March 28th, 2008. Thomas Alec Tizon he went into his office in downtown Seattle expecting to see the article, see the issue of the LA Times. His office had been cleaned out. There wasn't a stick of furniture or a book in his office. He had been fired by the LA Times, in part for this article. Next slide, please, Jennifer. That's Mr. Robert J. Gribble. If any of you has received my business card, I acknowledge his contribution at the bottom of my card. He was a retired Seattle fireman. In the summer of 1974, he argued that what we needed was a hotline where people could call if they believed they'd been witness to a possible UFO sighting. He set it up in October 74, ran it delightfully well. His stamina is unbelievable. I guess the stamina of a firefighter, and did a wonderful job. Next slide, please. This is, when I refer to the Royal We, this is a group of people who have worked on or for the UFO Reporting Center over the course of the last 40 years. Today, it is principally this gentleman, Christian Stepien, who is our pro bono webmaster. He's done it pro bono for 18 years. If you go to our website, ufocenter.com, all of that is the product of his contribution to the UFO community. Next slide, please, Jennifer. Well, a lot of you recognize that building, but I'll bet a lot of you don't understand the background of the object on top. What does it look like to you? A UFO. And in point of fact, it was patterned after a UFO sighting that occurred June 24th, 1947, the famous Ken Arnold case. In point of fact, the spire was a takeoff, I suspect, and I'm conjecturing here, a takeoff. They borrowed a photograph that was taken on the 11th of May, 1950 in McMinnville, Oregon, about an hour's drive southwest of Portland. It was Paul Trent, Mr. Paul Trent, and his wife were out in their garden, and they saw this disc orbiting around their house, and it stopped and it tilted on its side, and he took a photograph. Many of you, I don't see enough people here old enough to remember the life or Time magazine, not Time, the Life or the Look magazine that carried that photo. It may have appeared in True magazine, but that is the origin of the design of that. It was designed on a paper napkin in 13 Coins restaurant by Mr. Eddie Carlson and Mr. Don L. Clark. I had the privilege of knowing both of those men. Eddie Carlson, of course, the chairman of United Airlines and Westin Hotels. Don Clark, the CEO of a big construction firm. Next slide, if we could, please, Jennifer. Okay. I mentioned earlier that we're going to try to take back the date of the first UFO sighting. How many people want to guess how far back we can go? A few years, couple decades, century, millennia? Anybody vote for millennia? How do you get historical records from prehistory times? You're pretty daring, but let's see what happens. This is a very, very interesting article written by Mr. John O'Keefe. It appears in the June 1960 issue of Sky and Telescope, I believe. I'm remiss, I don't remember. It was back in the days before they put the attribution on the bottom of the page, so when you photocopy it, people know where it came from. This is an article written by a NASA scientist, John O'Keefe, at the Goddard Space Center. It's about the Cyrilid meteor shower. Now let me describe how far astronomers will go to twist the facts to have things conform to their way. This article is very interesting. It describes an incident that occurred near Toronto, in fact, all across Canada, all across the New England states of the United States. It was even recorded by ships at sea in their logs. It's called the Cyrilid meteor shower. If we could go to the next slide, please, we'll understand a little better. This is what happened. A bunch of Canadian astronomers near Toronto, they taught at the University of Toronto, if I'm not mistaken, I'm not sure of that. They were standing outside having some kind of barbecue or some kind of social event. It was the 9th of February, 1913. Before airplanes had become popular, of course. They existed, but it was not yet the First World War when they really started to develop quickly. And one of the gentlemen looked to the southwestern sky from Toronto and he said, "What's this?" I'm animating this a little bit. And everybody looked up, and what they saw was a cluster of lights moving slowly across the sky, so they were visible for, I'm guessing, 2 minutes or so. They weren't streaking. They were not a meteor. They were not a satellite in 1913. They were not aircraft. So this cluster of lights started to move across the sky in a leisurely fashion. Somebody must have said, "Hey, there's a second one." And lo and behold, here comes a second cluster of lights in more or less symmetrical fashion, or I should say unwavering formation. Their position relative to one another was not changing, like the Blue Angels in most cases. And then a third one. I don't know, it's been a while since I've read the article, but it was cluster after cluster after cluster after cluster. And next slide, excuse me, just a second. This, by the way, is a painting, and it gives the details of who did it down here. I guess there were several paintings done by some of the astronomers who are artists to a degree. We are looking south, and we know that because it's winter time, and the constellation of stars called Orion is in the southern sky at that time of year. So they must have been looking to the south, and those lights, those formations of lights continued across New England where they were recorded. They continued out to the North Atlantic where they were recorded in the logs of ships. Next slide, please, Jennifer. And what the author did in preparation for this June 1960 article, he went to all of these communities in the United States and Canada indicated by dots and triangles. And those are places that he looked in the newspaper archives, the morgues, if you will, for references, allusions to this incident. And where you see the triangles, and there are quite a few of them in there, even though you may not be able to see them, they had hits. They discovered articles about this strange aerial event. So, and he argued, many astronomers said, well, this is what happened. We know what had to have happened. These were rogue meteors in formation that were accidentally captured by the gravitational force of the planet Earth, and they went into orbit, and that's that. That's how far PhDs' imaginations will go. Thank God I never got one. Sorry, Joe, I didn't. It doesn't include Joe. Anyway, they then said, well, if they were captured, they went into orbit. The time period of an orbit in low Earth orbit is about 90 or 92 minutes. And they said in 92 minutes, the Earth would have rotated this far as it rotates to the east. And therefore, on the next orbit, they should have passed over this part, this part of the central United States, the Midwest. So they went out there and looked in the archives, the newspaper morgues, and they didn't find one allusion to it. Very, very interesting case. And to this day, astronomers will say, well, yes, they were the rogue meteors. Next slide, if we could, please, Jennifer. Here's a better picture. They went to all of these communities in the Midwest, Missouri and Nebraska, and they didn't find one reference to this incident. Next slide, please. So that was 1913, again, February 9th, St. Cyril's Day. That's why they call it the Cyrilid meteor shower. Let's go back a couple decades. This is an article out of the Tacoma Daily News. It's written on the 2nd of July, is it? 3rd of July, thank you, 1893. Now, I'm sure some of your speed readers have assimilated the text there, but let me describe to you in rough arm-waving round figures what took place. On the 1st of July, a group of fishermen left Tacoma. They didn't leave in motorboats because in 1893 they didn't have motorboats. They left in a sailing yacht. And they weren't going to fish for salmon. They were going out to an island in the middle of Puget Sound near Tacoma to go trout fishing on the island. They had trout on the island. So they sailed out there, and they went to bed the 1st of July that night. And the next morning, as they're sleeping under their blankets, didn't have sleeping bags in 1893, of course, they were awakened by a shrieking sound and by intensely bright flashes of light, strobing. They peeked out from under their covers. Could we go to the next slide, please, Jennifer? I'm going to describe for you, just very briefly, what happened, as described by this article. One of the braver men, got out from under his covers, and he started walking down to the shore. What they saw, according to this article, was a cigar-shaped craft with what appeared to be copper bands running around it, like the wrapper on a cigar. And at one end of this electric monster, they called it, yes, electric monster, were clear eyes, about 5 clear eyes on the front of it. Sounds like a ship, and it was strobing bright light. You're going to see that before this talk is over. One guy, Mr. McDonald, allegedly, was struck senseless when he walked down closer to the shore, and this thing spat out a sudden bolt of light that hit him in the chest, much like the Travis Walton case. I suspect many of you have heard of Travis Walton. And it rendered him unconscious. It blew him back on the beach. He was unconscious for some estimated 30 minutes. That's 1893. Let's see how far back we can continue. Next slide, please, Jennifer. Well, this is a very interesting text. I used to teach at the University of Washington. I used to live in the University District of Seattle. And one of my dear friends was Dr. David Konectes. He was my opponent at handball at the student gym. Dr. David Konectes, magna cum laude from Yale, PhD from Yale in Oriental languages, most of all ancient Chinese is his specialty. He knew my interest in UFOs, but he wasn't interested, really. He had other things to do. At the time, his magnum opus was to translate a big, thick text in ancient Chinese. This is 600-800 years ago, for which there is no dictionary. Imagine translating ancient anything without a dictionary. And he came up to me and he said, "Peter, I think you ought to look at this. I just translated this section, and it smacks of something that you are more interested in than I am." And this is what happened. I won't read the whole thing, but it is a description from roughly, let's say, the year 1063 AD of a luminous pearl that used to fly out of the swamp in one community or one area of ancient China. Very interesting text. Now, I'm a stickler for documentation. So if we could please go to the next slide, Jennifer. For those of you who'd like the original text, there's the ancient Chinese. I'd be happy to make a copy available for anybody who's really scholarly and daring. Next slide, please, Jennifer. Well, we've all heard of cave paintings, but this is a very interesting one. It looks like a type of monster with a helmet on or something. There's a great deal of editorial comment or influence in my statement, but it is intriguing. And this is from 8,000 years ago, found in the Tassili, I guess is the title or the name of the town, Sahara Desert, North Africa. So it takes us back at least 8,000 years before today. Let's try one more slide and see how far back we can go. Cave painting from 10,000 BC in Italy. It shows men possibly floating in the sky. They have things held in their arms. I can't see it very well from where I am, but that takes the phenomenon back, possibly, in a conjectural sense anyway, about 12,000 years. The question is it millennia, or is it millions of years, or is it billions of years that craft have been coming to our planet? We don't know the answer to that question yet. So it's very interesting. Let's go to the next slide, please, if we could. Next question is, does the government know about UFOs? Well, I think so. And this document is one of a couple I'm going to show you that suggest to me that they do. This is a document, it's technical report TR R277, technical report R277. It's a chronological catalog of, can somebody read that for me? Chronological catalog of reported lunar events. This is what happened. This was published a year before man first walked on the moon, July of 1969, so published in July of 68. Mrs. Barbara M. Middlehurst, who was a very skilled light astronomer at Flagstaff, Arizona, was commissioned by NASA to go through all of the ancient, not ancient texts, but all of the texts of the world's great light astronomers, going back about 500 years. They wanted them to go through those handwritten records with a fine-tooth comb to see if they could find any kind of reference to any kind of unusual event on the moon. How many could there be? I mean, we all look at the moon, right? And there's nothing going on up there. Would you accept my proposition? Anybody want to guess how many they found? Okay, I don't see any hands, so I'll take that as a no. They found between 6,000 and 7,000 references in the logs, the handwritten logs and notes of the world's leading light astronomers going back to the year 1500 or earlier. They winnowed down those 6,000 to 7,000 to about 600. It's about a 60 or 70, maybe an 80-page article. But this is the document that NASA received from Barbara Middlehurst. Next slide, please. This is, for example, one of the entries, the year 1587, if I'm reading it right, in March A steer was seen in the body of the moon upon the blank of March, whereat many men marveled, and not without cause, for it stood directly between the points of her horns, the more being changed, not passing for 5 to 6 days. In other words, there was an anomaly on a specific point in the moon that this astronomer saw, and presumably other astronomers may have seen it as well. What it was, I cannot tell you. We'll never know. But it's interesting that they found so many of these anomalies in astronomers' notes when they went through them very, very carefully. Next slide, please, Jennifer. Anybody know of this document? It's a federal publication. The Fire Officer's Guide to Disaster Control, they're the authors, Kramer and Bame, I think. The reason this is interesting, again, a federal publication published by the federal government of the United States to train emergency responders to disasters, to control disasters. Let's go to chapter 13 in the next slide. Let's see what it says. It says, chapter 13, of course it's chapter 13. We're ufologists, right? That's like the day I was on the CBS News with Dan Rather. Anybody want to guess the date? April 1st, 1996. April Fool's Day. It always happens. This is a very interesting chapter. It's what to do in the event of enemy attack and UFO potential. The UFO threat, a fact. And it talks about the Battle of Los Angeles that occurred on I think it was the 26th of February, 1942. Linda Howe alluded to that today, citing how many artillery rounds, anti-aircraft artillery rounds were fired. She said 1,400. I think it says something close to that amount. I can't see, 1,433. So it seems odd to me, and I suspect it does to you, that if the federal government believes that the UFO phenomenon is pure folly and malarkey, why are they publishing a training manual to alert the possibility of such a disaster to bring it to the attention of emergency responders? Next slide, please. Okay. The other question on that list of 5 questions that I hope to resolve in the course of this talk was, do UFOs ever malfunction? Do they crash? Well, if any of you heard the testimony of the Roswell lineup this morning, you probably have formulated an opinion, but let's examine a more recent event. January 7th, 1995. I had just started. I was green behind the ears, wet behind the ears, I guess the analogy is, after I'd taken over the hotline just 5 months earlier in August of 1994. So just after the turn of the year, I got a call from the Tennessee Emergency Management Agency, and I'm going to describe to you what happened. They said there was a duty officer who called me, and he said, my name is so-and-so. I'm a duty officer at the Tennessee Emergency Management Agency. He said, I've been ordered to contact the National UFO Reporting Center and fax you some material. Do you have a fax? And I said, I don't right here, but I can give you a fax number. It was at a local 24-hour photocopy shop in the University District of Seattle, and he said, fine. He said, we have had a UFO blow up over McMinnville, Oregon, Warren County, I think it is. And I said, really? Yes. He said, we have been activated as a result of this event. And he said, I have been ordered by the AFRCC, the Air Force Rescue and Recovery Center, to send you the information. He said they ordered us to share the information with the National UFO Reporting Center. He said, are you a secret organization, a secret arm of the government? I assured him I was not. They're my adversary, of course. And he said, well, I'm going to follow through on my orders. Please give me the fax number. Within 20 or 30 minutes, I was there. I had the fax that you're about to see. So the OIC officer in charge, AFR, I can't read it from here, but AFRCC is it? And you can see all of the contact information and Tennessee Emergency Management Agency. Could we have the next slide, please, Jennifer? This is a little bit better. The date was flawed on the last one. It said 94. This is January 8th, 1995. This is a fax cover sheet. And to the National UFO Reporting Center, there's our number, 722-3000, and from Mike Smith, the operations officer, and so on. Next slide, please. And what he faxed me was a sheriff deputy's report about the alleged incident. This is what happened. That night, and I believe it was a Saturday night, people in McMinnville, Tennessee, not a big city necessarily, but they were big enough to have an airport. People were looking at the airport, and what they saw was a cluster, a flotilla of objects embedded in strange light that they were hovering above the McMinnville, Tennessee airport. And at a certain point, they started descending, but descending very slowly. And as they continued to descend, suddenly, there was an immense explosion and flash. Big blue chunks of burning material were thrown high in the sky, and they cascaded down over the airport. Could we have the next slide, please? Now, for speed readers, you may be able to get through all of this, but I'm going to just tell you that these 4 pages are the handwritten report of a deputy sheriff who went out to investigate the incident to find out what had happened. And he's talking about the explosion, he's talking about the fragments, and so on and so forth. Next slide, please, Jennifer. This is the deputy sheriff's hand-drawn map. The airport is at the center of this map, and these radians that are going out are to the locations of various witnesses who had called the sheriff's department reporting that they were looking towards the airport, watching this flotilla of craft slowly descend and reporting the explosion. I don't know what happened here. I cannot tell you it was a UFO. It sounds very suspicious in my opinion. A few days after this event, I was on a radio program talking about it. I tried to get the local radio stations and television stations to initiate an investigation. Brick wall. Ran into a wall. Oh, what are you talking about? Whether it is because they were influenced somehow not to report it, I don't know. I can't make that representation. But a young man who was studying to become a private investigator at a university in Kentucky heard me, said, Mr. Davenport, I'm going to go down there. He said, I'd like to be your agent, or at least I will send you the data after I've done the investigation. And he went around McMinnville knocking on people's doors. And he discovered that within 90 minutes of this explosion, there were people who they were asleep in their homes, many of them rural homes, and there were knocks on their front doors. And they went to the front door, those who were brave enough to do so, and there were not one but 2 people in uniform, I believe, but I'm not sure, who apprised the occupants of that residence that those 2 people were government employees, that they had had an airplane blow up, and that they would like permission to go on people's property to recover the fragments of the airplane. Most people consented to that. They were gone the next morning. No follow-up, no nothing. Very, very interesting case. Next slide, please, Jennifer. So let's go through these 5 questions that I pose. Do astronomers ever see UFOs? Have we resolved that question to everybody's satisfaction? I mean, technical report R277, the sighting over Toronto, Ontario, and so on and so forth. Of course, astronomers see UFOs. We get reports from amateur and professional astronomers over the hotline all the time. Does the U.S. government know about UFOs? Well, if they don't know about the battle over Los Angeles in February of 1942, it's time for the American people to take back their government and fire everybody who's in it. Of course they know about it, plus the publications. Technical report, again, 277 applies in this case too, and the training manual. Good video, you'll see in a bit. Do UFOs ever have mechanical malfunctions? Well, the case from McMinnville, Tennessee, not Oregon, Tennessee, is suggestive of that possibility. And if UFOs are real objects, how long have they been here? I think we've laid that one to rest pretty well. Not conclusive. We don't have bone-crushing proof, but a lot of very strong suggestion. Next slide, please, Jennifer. First case, the La Crosse, Washington. This occurred about 2 hours south of where I live in the state of Washington, out in the southeast corner of Washington State. It's wheat-growing country. We refer to it, all the area, collectively as the Palouse. This is what happened. A mother and her 6 children were taking a shortcut home, driving north on Zering Cutoff Road. That was a fateful mistake, the mother admitted to me later, in Whitman County, Washington, southeast Washington, when they witnessed something intense, some intensely bright lights ahead. Shortly after first witnessing the lights, they all witnessed 3 delta-shaped craft slowly pass over their car and in front of their car in formation, slowly. I'm going to show you the mother's illustrations and the oldest daughter's illustrations. The mother, after this incident, admitted to me she was so terrified by it. She called me 3 days after the event. She called me on the 1st of January 1995. She would not go outside after dark. Next slide, please. This is what the 3 objects looked like, according to the mother. They had been hovering over a wintertime wheat field, motionless. They had a bright headlight on the nose of the craft, up here, this is the nose, that shone yellow light on the ground ahead of the craft as they moved across the field. There was a small louver in the ventral surface, and I'll explain in a moment why. Each craft approximately 40 by 40 feet. Sizable craft, the size of a small aircraft. Next slide, please. What she saw, and her 6 children in the back seat and the front seat saw, you can wonder how many had seat belts on if she had 6 children. That was not all of them, by the way. The mother had stopped on Zering Cutoff Road, right here, and this is her illustration. It's a big illustration like this. She went to great trouble to do this illustration. She saw these 3 black objects. At first, all they saw was the bright lights in the distance over the field. And she said to her kids, "Hey, look at those 18-wheelers out in the middle of the field." She should have known better. How many 18-wheeler trucks are you going to have out in the middle of a wheat field in the middle of winter in Washington State? Not many. There's a lot of snow out there. And her kids said, "Mommy, those aren't 18-wheelers." She looked back when she had a moment to take her eyes off the road, and she said, "You're right." So she stopped her car in the road, in the highway, rolled down her driver's window, and sat there while these things, 2 of them passed in front of her, 1 of them passed over her car. They got out to the left-hand side of the car, and all 3 of them, as if on the same command, simply rotated in the horizontal plane. So now they're pointed to the south, and they continue to move south. As they moved down the left side of her vehicle, because her window was down, she could hear a high-pitched whining. She said it sounded like a high-speed hydraulic pump or a high-speed refrigerator motor. That's what happened. Next slide, please. Here's the mother's illustration. Here's the oldest daughter's illustration showing the 3 objects in unwavering formation, projecting a light out ahead of them, and that's the daughter, what the daughter had to provide. Very, very interesting case. Next slide, please. Pennsylvania Fireball. This is going to allow me to play the best video in my possession, the best video I have seen of a possible, even probable UFO. I think you'll conclude it's almost certainly a UFO that was photographed. But this is what happened. It was a Friday morning on the East Coast. It was 40 minutes past midnight on Friday, the 25th of August, 1995. So 18 years ago. Hard to believe it's that long ago for me. And a bright object Up in Ontario, Canada, there was a television news team out on an investigation from Channel 4 in Toronto. I talked to a Canadian gentleman today. I asked him if he knew Channel 4. He said he did. And they saw an object coming at them from the north-northeast, and the photographer who had the camera had the presence of mind to hit the record button. And he tracked that object through the sky, and I'm going to show you that video in just a moment. Next slide, please. Well, it was up here in Toronto. If we're talking about one object, and I can't certify that's the case, it came streaking down across Toronto. It crossed Lake Erie. It crossed right into the state of Pennsylvania, the West End. Here's the little shoreline that northwestern Pennsylvania has on Lake Erie. It slashed down across western Pennsylvania, and it stopped near Breezewood, Pennsylvania, on the Pennsylvania Turnpike. Now, let me begin by playing some audio. I'm going to play 3 audio clips. They're very short. We're going to start with the audio clip of a young woman who called me just 5 minutes after all of this had occurred. She had heard me on radio. She had the number of the hotline. Let me play, I think it's about 15 or 20 seconds, maybe 30 seconds of an audio clip of what that young woman reported had just gone over her head. She's in very close to the northwestern corner of Pennsylvania. Could we have that first audio?
Yeah, a big ball of white light, and behind it was like orange flame stuff, and it just shot across the sky like really fast, and then all of a sudden it disappeared. It kind of like the entire sky, like 5 minutes ago. So it was like 12:40 our time. Mom says about 10 seconds. It seemed to go really fast, but yet it was going from north to south.
North to south.
Approximately 5 minutes ago,
Okay, next
I
one.
saw
Cleveland,
what
Ohio.
looked like a nuclear explosion in the sky.
Oh, really?
I mean, lit up the whole neighborhood, more than one.
I can't hear you, Jennifer. Let me do a little setup on that. Can we replay that in a moment? That second audio clip? If you could rewrap it, this is what happened. While I was talking to that young woman on the telephone, because we have call waiting, a second call came in and I was able to capture it. Young man from western Cleveland, he was 110 miles approximately, my best estimate, from the ground track of the fireball that you're going to see on video here in a moment. 110 miles away from it. It was so bright an object that when he saw it, his impression was that the nuclear power plant, which I gather is on the east side of Cleveland, Ohio, had blown up. It had melted down, gone up in a fireball. So let's play, if we could please, that second audio clip. Listen to the emotion in his voice. You can tell that his voice is wavering.
Approximately 5 minutes ago, I saw what looked like a nuclear explosion in the sky.
Oh, really?
I mean, it lit up the whole neighborhood, more than one flash.
Okay.
Like 3, maybe 4. But the size of it, the mass of it was so great that it was,
Yeah.
you know, it was blinding, and I thought for sure that it was a nuclear bomb explosion.
Yes.
Okay, we're going to go to a third audio clip here. This one is from Niles, Ohio, very close to the Ohio-Pennsylvania border. And you may have to turn the volume down a little bit.
Our home.
Okay, here we go.
Everything started to turn blue in our bedroom, and all the area, all our backyard, and all the neighborhood was all blue. And I jumped up and I thought, oh, I don't know what to do. I was afraid that it was going to crash into us. But it had a cabin, like in the front. It was 4 or 5 windows and very bright lights. And I thought probably someone was looking out the windows. And it was a blue, green, and like a great big round spaceship. Great big, just shaped like a hamburger, you know, but it was blue and green, and I think there was some orange on the back of it.
And how long did you watch it, do you estimate?
I probably watched that for about maybe 5 minutes. Then I jumped up and I went to the window and I said to my husband, "Oh, something's happened. All the backyard is blue. The treetops are blue. The drapes are blue." He was blue. Everything was blue. A beautiful blue-green. You know, they're talking about a meteorite, but it definitely was not a meteorite. Because I moved away because I was kind of frightened.
How many people think that that could have been a meteor? If it's hovering over a backyard for 5 minutes, it looks like a hamburger, and it has a cockpit window in it, and people looking back at her, is that a meteor? Well, let's look at some video here in a moment. I'm going to show you a news report from the station whose investigative team was out in the field with that cameraman. They captured it on video. Let me set it up so you understand what you're going to see. You'll see the anchor woman talk about this event, building up to playing the video. And listen closely to how she reports it was a meteor shower. Everything for the newscasters is a meteor shower. No, this is one object. You're going to see an object perfectly round. Please note that it's above the clouds. It's strobing and flickering. You're going to see it both in normal speed and slow motion. And the camera is facing south-southeast, I estimate, roughly. The object is going to be going almost directly away from the camera or angling a little to the left. And I would invite you, when you see that round object, keep watching down at the 5:30 position, below and to the right of this big, round, strobing ball above the clouds, and you tell me what you see. It's evident only for half a second or a second. Let's go to the video if we could, please, Jennifer. And a little sound, if you could. Any sound for it? Okay. We apparently don't have sound, but it doesn't matter because you're going to see video footage here in a moment of this ball there it is, slow motion, perfectly round. You'll see it again. There's 2 or 3 times they play it. That was slow motion. You're going to see it here in a moment, normal speed, I believe. There it goes. See, it's above the clouds. Watch down here. Watch down here. Tell me what you see.
Maybe it's the lights in the room that make it hard.
Yeah, that could be. Yep. Well, we'll go to the end of this. It runs only a few more seconds, I think. You'll see that object again.
What are these people reporting?
Many people thought that the meteors caused a domicile, a residence, to catch fire. And they were looking for radioactivity in the home. Why they would expect radioactivity from a meteor that caused a fire is not clear to me at all. But we'll go to, and this gentleman, a professor of astronomy, I think, or some technical field. Watch down here if you can. See it strobe? Yeah, we didn't see it very well. There's a little tiny light that streaks from behind the clouds up into the sky in the direction of that object. Now, how many meteors have you heard about in your life have done that? Is anybody going back to the Washington Plaza Hotel or catching a bus? It's getting to be within 5 minutes of that bus if you want to take off. Next slide, please, if we could. We're going to play some audio clips of what if we could, any possibility?
Oh, we're having some audio difficulties.
Okay. Well, the speaker has his difficulties too, so I guess we're even. Let me actually I've done 2 cases. How many people are ready to head for home? Getting close? Pardon?
Which clip? Let's try it again now.
It's starting again now?
You want to do that one again?
Yes.
Okay. Video. Which one do you want?
I don't know what they're, are you talking about the video, Jennifer?
Whatever you have.
The what?
They're asking which video do you want.
Just tell
Okay.
us.
Do you want the video or do you want an audio clip?
I'd like an audio entitled Breezewood. Okay. I've played those 3 people up in northern Pennsylvania. In a moment, we're going to play an audio clip of a conversation I had with a gentleman, a professional race car driver. 3 days after this event, this is now Monday, on the 28th of August, 1995, as he was driving west on the Pennsylvania Turnpike, headed for a professional race in Ohio. As he was driving along, suddenly the valley that he was driving in lit up like it was daylight at high noon on the 4th of July. And then it happened again and again, 6 or 8 of these episodes. And he looked out to his left, to the south, and he saw a very, very strange object. Let's let him tell his own story while they try to boot up the slides. Can you play the Breezewood audio? Can't find it? Okay, we may not be able to play it, but let me tell you what happened. I will speak for the gentleman. If we get the audio running, an hour. I said, Monty, how do you know it was 87 miles an hour? He said, Peter, I'm a professional race car driver. There's a big difference between 85 and 87 for those drivers. Okay, I bought the point. He looked out to this object off to his left, south side of the Pennsylvania Turnpike, that's strobing green, I think he said blue light at first. And it strobed about 6 occasions or so, lighting up the entire valley. As far as he could see was lit up like daylight.
With a dark band around the midsection and a dark concentric circle towards the bottom of it. So the object's pulsing with a very pronounced blue light. It pulsed, it seemed to be stationary, and it pulsed about 8 times with a blue light and then switched to a green light. So it did not appear to be moving. It was not streaking. It was very slow.
I was looking at the Milky Way.
Okay. What he described was the pulsing, he said, a stationary light. And I said, Monty, how fast was it going? He said it wasn't going at all. He said it was hovering over the valley off to the left of me. Hovering, I said. That was the object that had streaked down from Canada across Lake Erie and down the west end of Pennsylvania. No, he said it was stationary. And after the 8th time it strobed, it was gone. Here's where it gets very interesting, ladies and gentlemen. Very interesting. After that first conversation on the afternoon of Monday, the 28th of August, about 20 minutes later, he called me back. This is a telltale sign for any experienced UFO investigator. He said, Peter, there's something I forgot to tell you. For the last 3 nights, I've been having nightmares about little creatures that have almond-shaped heads and black almond eyes. I said, what? And then he called me again a few minutes later and continued the story. Now, I asked him during one of these conversations, when did you see this object? And he said, I've forgotten the exact time, 1:20 or 1:40 p.m. a.m. after midnight, hour and a half after midnight. And I said to myself, well, he just hasn't set his clock. He's about to cross a time zone and his clock is off. His watch is off by an hour or so. And I went back to that issue and I probed a little bit more deeply, and lo and behold, his watch had been set to the East Coast time. He was still in the Eastern time zone. It was an accurate watch. It was a racing watch. It appears to me, ladies and gentlemen, and I have no proof, that this gentleman who was driving down westbound on the Pennsylvania Turnpike with his race car and a trailer behind his towing vehicle may have been scooped off the highway. And the reason he noted a different time from the time that all of these other people up north had seen it was because he may have been aboard that craft. It is a very, very interesting case, in my opinion. Could we go to, do we have slides at all, or are they dead?
No, we do. Do you want to go play any more audio?
Any more what?
Audio.
We'll play more audio in a couple more cases, if that's possible. Aztec and Farmington?
Oh, you want to play the videos?
Yeah, we'll play Speaker's worst nightmare. But I understand the problems you're having. I will just continue talking, Jennifer, and if you get something set up, just wave your hand and we'll go back to the
Just tell us what you'd like next.
Can you get the slides back, or is that a dead letter? Must be a time warp or some kind of electromagnetic anomaly. They don't want me to go to the Phoenix Lights case. Anyway, very, very interesting case. You've heard a bit of the audio for the three people up north and the race car driver below. I've forgotten what the next case is, but I think it's, is it the New Mexico flash? Okay. Let me, in any event, I'm going to jump to a next case. Whether it is the next case or not is unimportant. Let's go out. I'm going to skip the Phoenix Lights for a moment because we don't have the visual in front of us. Let me just say, how many people have heard of the Phoenix Lights case? Good. Let's skip it, and if we can get slides up, we may go back to it. Let me just say, oh, there we go. All right. One of the questions I asked earlier, one of those 5 questions that I wanted to answer during this presentation is, do astronomers ever see UFOs? Well, this letter proves or answers that question. 4 of the witnesses to the event you just saw, that blue light streaking down from north to south, were in the vicinity of New York City, about 240 miles to the east of the ground track of that blue object. 2 of them were PhDs, and fortunately, they were PhDs in astronomy and astrophysics. These guys were experienced sky watchers and experienced astronomers. They had gone up to Connecticut to have dinner. One of the guys was the PhD astronomer. He and his wife were out with another couple, and I don't know if it was the other couple's wife or husband that was the PhD in astronomy. But in any event, this guy called me. He said, Mr. Davenport, I saw something extraordinarily unusual. And he said, I am an astronomer, and I have no explanation for what I saw on Friday morning. And I said, let me guess the time. Was it 40 minutes past midnight? And he said, exactly. So what he describes in his 1-page typewritten report, and the reason I know that he's a PhD is because it took me 14 months to get him to write that report and submit it to me. He mailed it in. This is before the internet, before email. And he talks about this incident, and what he saw as he and his wife and the other couple looking to the west saw was a blue strobing ball of light descending and streaking from their right to left, that is north to south. And he said it was the most peculiar thing. When it got to a certain point, it suddenly sent out a ring of light that expanded out like a bubble. He said, Mr. Davenport, I've got a PhD in physics. That is impossible. If light radiates from a luminous body, it goes out at the speed of light. Your eye can't follow it going out into space. He said, I have no explanation for what that object was. And that weekend, the next day, he went to an astronomy gathering, a conference, and he told some of his colleagues about this, and nobody had any explanation. Next slide, please. And that's the ground track of the object, and it stopped down here near Bedford or There are 2 towns, Breezewood. The Pennsylvania Turnpike goes along the southern tier of Pennsylvania. Next slide, please. That's what it looked like to the professional race car driver as he looked out to the left, to the south, out of his car window. a blue flickering ball with a black band around the equator of it and a black circle around the bottom. Enough said on the Pennsylvania fireball, August 25th, 1995. Next slide, if we could, please. Phoenix Lights, I'm going to go through this quickly. The one thing I want to impress upon you was how dramatic and how bizarre this event was and how big the triangles were. Could we have the next slide? I'm going to go through this quickly. I'm over time a bit, and I'm going to go for just a couple more minutes, and then we're going to call it quits. Is that okay with everybody? It's late, and everybody wants to get home. This is what happened. You all know the Phoenix Lights. What you may not know is two U.S. Air Force F-15s were scrambled out of Luke Air Force Base. Next slide, please. This is the first report. In point of fact, the Phoenix Lights should not be called the Phoenix Lights. They should be called the Henderson, Nevada Lights because of this report. This report was written on March 18th, 1997, Henderson, Nevada. So about 5 days, was it 5 days after the event had occurred? This is a detailed report, not sophisticated in any respect, but it tells us what we need to know. Gentleman was in Henderson, Nevada, which is the southeast community in Las Vegas, and he saw a cluster of wedge-shaped objects go over his head, headed to the southeast. Within minutes, they were headed down towards Phoenix. Next slide, please. Here's another handwritten report we received. Next slide, if we could, please. This is the first page of my handwritten notes for the first caller about the Phoenix Lights. You can see it's 22 hours, is it, on the 13th of March. And before this night was over, 8 hours later, my floor was covered with pieces of paper like that. I had 2 tapes full of what people had reported. People were calling from Phoenix every 15 or 30 seconds, demanding to know what had just gone over their heads. This is the event that the Air Force tried to convince us later, within days, had been caused by flares launched 80 miles to the southwest of Phoenix. Next slide, please. That's what the object first looked like to one of the witnesses. Next slide, please. And people reported a variety of craft. This is substantially different from the last one. This is a big V-shaped object. To give you some idea of how big this is, I estimate that it's many miles across, and that these lights, which were like recessed lights in the ceiling, were upwards of 200 yards in diameter. Those lights are 200 yards wide, twice the length of a football field. Next slide. This is not a photo, it's artwork. It's a rendition done by an artist who talked to the actual witnesses, Rob and Lee. I know he talked to them at length because he paid for it on my phone card. Next slide, please. This is an example of what people saw and reported. This one guy was so desirous of showing what it really looked like that he used black paper and painted it with white ink to simulate a black night sky and show what the lights look like. That's how big the full moon looks like relative to the object. Next slide, if we could, please. Next slide. I'm going to play show a couple more slides and then play one more video, maybe 2 more videotapes, and you will understand better why my calculation is that these objects one of the objects was not less, from wingtip to wingtip, was not less than 7.4 U.S. terrestrial statute miles. This is a photograph of Camelback Mountain north of Sky Harbor Airport. Sky Harbor Airport has a major runway running east and west. Tempe and Scottsdale are out here. This is Camelback Mountain because of its profile, its shape. Next slide, please. At approximately 8:20 p.m., between 8:20 and 8:25, Mrs. Susan Watson, who has 7 children, like the woman from La Crosse, was buttoning up her house. She was going to take 4 of her children, 2 sons, 2 daughters, to an Irish music fest in preparation for St. Patrick's Day on the 17th of March. And when she's turning off lights and she's shutting doors and windows and getting ready to depart her house, her kids out in the front lawn start screaming, "Mommy, Mommy, get out here quickly." She thought it was an aircraft that was maybe crashing. So she races out of the house, and this is what she's confronted with. This is an approximation of what she saw. A huge chevron-shaped object. Let me show you graphically how big it looked to her and her 4 children. On a radio show 5 years after this occurred, and then again 10 years later, we had her on the 5th and 15th anniversaries of this event. I asked her to hold up her arms while she was talking on the radio and have her sons, who were technically inclined, estimate the angle her arms formed above her head. And she said, and her son said, "Mom, that looks like about 135 degrees of arc. That is more than 90 degrees, 135 degrees of arc." That's how big the object was above them. It blanked out the sky. Now, next slide, if we could, please. This is her handwritten illustration. Let's go to the next slide, if we could, and we're going to play one more audio. I had Sue on the Jeff Rentz radio program 5 years after this incident. Could we play the audio, please? Susan Watson. Is it going to work, do you think? Yeah. Okay. And you're going to hear about a 2-minute audio clip of what Sue Watson had to report over the Jeff Rentz radio program while he and I interviewed Susan Watson. Describe what happened.
The airport and news stations and various people like that, and could not get anything. But actually, I think it was the airport that gave me Peter's number.
Very good. Okay, go ahead and tell us about it. Tell us what happened.
Well, actually, my children had gone out of the house before I did. We were going to a concert that night, and it was a little bit, maybe 20 minutes after 8. I'm not sure, at 8:25 or so. And my daughter came running in and said, "Mom, you've got to come out of here right now. We've got something coming over Camelback Mountain, which is a landmark in Phoenix, and we live just a mile below it." So I ran outside. At that time, I had 4 children that were outside with me, and we just watched it. It was the most unbelievable thing I've ever seen come over my house, and it came over extremely slow. I mean, it was just kind of coming over this Camelback Mountain, which is, like I say, a landmark with lots of housing on the mountain. Mm-hmm. I live in a pretty populated area, so everybody is watching the same thing that we are. And the kids started laying on their backs on the yard. You know,
they laid down.
Oh, they laid. A couple of the 2 boys laid down on their backs in the front yard because it was like magnificent. It was lit with this kind of I don't know how. I told Peter it was almost a yellowish light like they have in parking lots, and it was almost a boomerang shape, and it was a solid vehicle. It wasn't something that was separate.
It was coming right toward your house.
It was coming right at, very low. It was flying extremely low. There was absolutely no sound on it. And there were, I can't remember. I think there were 5 bright lights in front. And actually, at one point, I saw a laser kind of go down. It was really strange. The kids, we all saw different things. But what we were doing was just basically watching at a very, very slow pace this vehicle just flying over.
What a sight. What a sight that I just...
That's what she and her 4 children saw, and thousands or hundreds of thousands of people in Phoenix saw the same thing. This is the event that your U.S. Air Force claimed within days, they claimed, had been caused by some flares that had been launched 80 miles away over the Gila Bend Barium Goldwater firing range, 80 miles away. Flares caused what Sue Watson and her 4 children saw. Ladies and gentlemen, it's 10:30. You've been very patient. I'm sure you're tired. I'd like to thank you. You are the hardcore of this conference. And if you go out, thank you. If you go outside either of those doors and there's a man in a Santa Claus suit, he will give you a card certifying that you're the hardcore of the CHD convention. Anyway, you've been very nice to sit here. Thanks very much. Thanks for being here, folks.